She was barely surviving in the harsh West, living alone in an abandoned shack with nothing but her horse and her pride. One freezing night, a desperate stranger and his sick little girl appeared at her fire, begging for shelter. She had every reason to turn them away, but her heart wouldn't let her. She gave them warmth, food, and safety, never knowing that this man wasn't just any drifter. He was the most powerful rancher in the entire territory, worth more than she could ever imagine. And that one act of kindness, it was about to change her life forever. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from you. The wind screamed across the Red Canyon foothills, carrying with it the bite of an early winter that had come too soon and too fierce. Cassidy Brennan, Cass to anyone who knew her, though there weren't many left who did, crouched low beside the flickering fire outside the abandoned line shack she called home. The structure was barely standing, its wooden walls warped and split, but it kept the worst of the wind out, and that was more than most drifters had. She pulled her worn leather coat tighter around her shoulders, the frayed edges doing little against the cold. Her horse, a chestnut mare named Rusty, stood tethered nearby, head low, tail whipping against the gusts. Cass had spent the day mucking stalls at the Copper Ridge livery for $2 and a sack of oats. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them both alive for another week. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the night. Cass stirred the small pot of beans hanging over the flames, her stomach growling despite the meager portion she'd allow herself. She'd learned long ago how to stretch a meal, how to survive on less than most people thought possible. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind, hoofbeats. Cass's hand instinctively went to the old revolver tucked into her belt. Out here alone, a woman had to be ready for anything. The hoofbeats grew louder, uneven, desperate. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Two figures emerged from the shadows, a man on horseback, slumped forward, and a small bundle clutched against his chest. The horse stumbled, exhausted, its breath coming in heavy clouds of steam. "Help," the man's voice was hoarse, barely audible over the wind. "Please, my daughter." Cass's grip tightened on her revolver. She'd seen too many tricks, too many men who played on sympathy to get what they wanted. "Stop right there," she called out, her voice sharp. "State your business." The man reined his horse to a halt, swaying slightly in the saddle. In the firelight, Cass could see his face, weathered, exhausted, streaked with dirt. But it was the small figure in his arms that made her hesitate. A child, no more than 7, wrapped in a blanket, her face flushed with a fever. "She's burning up," the man said, his voice cracking. "We've been riding for hours." "The storm hit faster than we expected. I just need—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "I just need a fire. Somewhere warm, just for tonight." Cass studied him, every instinct screaming at her to send them away. She'd learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Men lied, they took, they left you with nothing. But the child, the little girl coughed, a weak, rattling sound that cut through the wind like a knife. Her small hand clutched at the man's coat, her lips trembling. Cass exhaled slowly, her breath fogging in the cold air. She looked at the man again, really looked. His clothes were travel-worn but well-made, his boots scuffed but sturdy. He didn't look like a drifter, but he didn't look like a threat either. He looked like a father, desperate and afraid. "One night," Cass said finally, her voice hard, "you stay by the fire. You don't come near the shack, you don't touch anything, and come sunrise you're gone." The man's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Cass stepped back, waving them forward. "Get down, carefully." The man dismounted slowly, cradling the child against his chest. Cass watched as he lowered himself to the ground near the fire, settling the little girl gently onto a bedroll he pulled from his saddlebag. The child whimpered, her eyes fluttering but not opening. Cass stood at a distance, revolver still within reach, her heart pounding. She didn't know who this man was, or why he was out here in the middle of nowhere with a sick child. But she knew one thing for certain. She'd just let strangers into her camp. And in the West, that could cost you everything. The fire crackled between them like a living thing, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. Cass kept her distance, sitting on an overturned crate with her back to the shack, eyes never leaving the strangers. The man had barely moved since settling by the fire, his attention fixed entirely on the little girl curled beneath his coat. "What's her name?" Cass asked, breaking the tense silence. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his face, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Ruby," he said quietly. "Her name's Ruby." Cass nodded, saying nothing more. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The wind had died down some, but the cold was relentless, seeping into bones and settling there like stone. Ruby coughed again, a harsh, painful sound that made the man flinch. He laid a hand on her forehead, his jaw tightening. "She's worse," he muttered, more to himself than to Cass. Cass watched him for a moment, then stood abruptly. "Wait here." She disappeared into the shack, returning moments later with a dented tin cup and a small cloth bundle. She knelt by the fire, dipping the cup into the pot of beans, then wrapped the cloth around it to keep from burning her hands. She held it out toward the man. "It ain't much, but it's hot," she said. The man stared at the cup, then at her. "I thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Cass replied, her tone flat. "Just take it." He accepted the cup carefully, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Cass pulled back quickly, returning to her crate. The man brought the cup to Ruby's lips, coaxing her to take small sips. The child barely stirred, but she swallowed, and that seemed to ease something in the man's expression. "What's your name?" Cass asked after a while. The man hesitated, just for a second. "Cole," he said. "Cole Colton." "Where were you headed, Cole Colton?" "Copper Ridge," he answered, his voice measured. "To see family." Cass raised an eyebrow. "In this weather? Through the canyon at night?" Cole's gaze dropped to Ruby. "We didn't have a choice." There was something in his voice, something guarded, like he was holding back more than he was saying. Cass didn't press. Out here, everyone had secrets. It was survival. "Well, Copper Ridge is a half-day's ride from here," Cass said, "assuming the trails aren't washed out. You're lucky you found this place." "Lucky," Cole repeated, a faint, bitter smile crossing his lips. "Yeah, lucky." Silence settled over them again, heavy and uncomfortable. Cass pulled her coat tighter, her eyes drifting to Ruby. The little girl's face was flushed, her breathing shallow. Fever was dangerous out here, especially for a child. No doctors for miles, no medicine. "She needs water," Cass said suddenly, standing again. "Cold water to bring the fever down." Cole looked up sharply. "I don't want to impose." "You already are," Cass cut him off. "But if you want her to make it through the night, you'll let me help." She moved to a small barrel near the shack, scooping water into a tin bowl. She grabbed another cloth, cleaner than the first, and brought both over, kneeling on the opposite side of Ruby. Without waiting for permission, she dipped the cloth into the water, wrung it out, and gently pressed it to the child's forehead. Ruby stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment. They were glassy, unfocused, but alive. "Shh," Cass murmured, her voice softer than she intended. "You're all right, little one. Just rest." Cole watched her, something unreadable passing over his face. "You're good with her," he said quietly. Cass didn't look at him. "Had a sister once. She got sick like this." "What happened?" Cass's hand stilled for just a moment. "She didn't make it." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Cole didn't respond, but his expression shifted, understanding maybe, or guilt. Cass wrung out the cloth again, laying it across Ruby's forehead. "That's why I know what to do," she said, her voice hard again. "And that's why you're staying put until morning. No arguments." Cole nodded slowly. No arguments. Cass stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Good. She returned to her crate, the fire crackling between them once more. The night stretched long and cold, but for the first time since they'd arrived, the tension had shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. Morning came pale and cold, the sun struggling to break through thick clouds that promised more bad weather. Cass woke to find Cole already awake, sitting beside Ruby, watching her sleep. The little girl's breathing was steadier now, her color not quite as flushed as the night before. Cass stretched, her back aching from sleeping half upright against the shack wall. She'd barely closed her eyes all night, too aware of the strangers in her camp to truly rest. "How is she, Cass?" Cass asked, her voice rough with sleep. Cole looked up, and for the first time she saw genuine relief in his eyes. "Better, I think." The fever broke sometime before dawn. Cass nodded, moving to stoke the fire back to life. "Good. Then you can ride out after breakfast." But even as she said it, she glanced toward the horizon. The clouds were darker now, hanging low over the canyon like a threat. Cole followed her gaze. "That doesn't look promising," he said quietly. "No," Cass admitted. "It doesn't." As if on cue, the first drops of rain began to fall. Fat, cold drops that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Within minutes, the world beyond the fire had disappeared behind a gray curtain of water. Thunder rumbled in the distance, deep and ominous. Cass swore under her breath. Storm's going to last all day, maybe into tonight. Cole looked at Ruby, still sleeping, then back at Cass. "I know you said one night, yeah, well, I also don't send people out into storms to die," Cass interrupted, though her tone was sharp. "You'll stay until it passes, but you make yourself useful." Cole's eyebrows lifted. "Useful how?" Cass gestured toward the shack. "Roof's been leaking for weeks. There's broken boards on the north side letting wind through. You look like you know your way around a hammer." A faint smile crossed Cole's face, the first real one she'd seen. "I've swung a hammer or two in my time." "Good. Tools are in the back." While Cole worked on patching the roof, Cass tended to Ruby. The little girl woke slowly, her eyes clearer than they'd been the night before. She looked up at Cass with wide, uncertain eyes. "Where's Papa?" Ruby's voice was small, fragile. "He's right outside, fixing the roof," Cass said gently. "You feeling better, little one?" Ruby nodded slowly, then coughed, softer this time, not the terrible rattle from before. Cass helped her sit up, wrapping the blanket tighter around her small shoulders. "Are you hungry?" Ruby nodded again, and Cass found herself smiling despite herself. She warmed up the last of the beans, adding a precious piece of dried meat she'd been saving. Ruby ate slowly, carefully, her small hands wrapped around the warm tin. "What's your name?" Ruby asked between bites. "Cass?" "That's a pretty name." Ruby smiled, and something in Cass's chest tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you, sweetheart." By midday, the rain hadn't let up, but the shack felt different, warmer somehow. Cole had patched the worst of the leaks and reinforced the north wall with boards he'd found in the shed. Water no longer dripped through the ceiling, and the wind no longer howled through the cracks. Cass watched him work from the doorway, grudgingly impressed. His movements were efficient, practiced. These weren't the hands of a man who'd spent his life behind a desk or giving orders. He knew real work. When he climbed down from the roof, soaked through but satisfied, Cass had hot coffee waiting, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she usually drank. She'd been saving it, but something made her want to share it. Cole accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around it. "Thank you. You earned it," Cass said simply. They stood together under the narrow overhang, watching the rain, sipping coffee in companionable silence. Ruby had fallen back asleep inside, tucked safely under Cass's only good blanket. "She likes you," Cole said quietly. Cass glanced at him. "She's a sweet kid. She doesn't usually warm up to strangers." Cole's voice carried something deeper, gratitude maybe, or something else Cass couldn't quite name. "Maybe she knows who to trust," Cass replied, then immediately regretted the words. They felt too open, too vulnerable. But Cole just smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Maybe she does. The rain continued to fall, but inside the patched-up shack, with Ruby sleeping peacefully and hot coffee warming their hands, the world felt a little less harsh, a little less lonely, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Cass didn't mind the company. The storm raged for 2 more days. By the second morning, an unexpected rhythm had settled over the little camp. Cole chopped firewood without being asked, his axe striking clean and true, building up a pile that would last Cass through the worst of winter. She pretended not to notice how much extra he was cutting, how he was leaving her better off than he'd found her. Ruby grew stronger each day, her fever gone, replaced by the restless energy of a child who'd been cooped up too long. She followed Cass everywhere, to the shed, to check on Rusty, even to the creek when the rain let up enough to refill the water barrels. "Can I help?" Ruby asked for the 100th time that afternoon, watching Cass mend a saddle strap. Cass glanced at the little girl, then handed her a spare piece of leather and a blunt needle. "Here. Practice your stitches on this." Ruby's face lit up like Christmas morning. She settled beside Cass on the porch, tongue poking out in concentration as she worked the needle through the leather. Her stitches were crooked and loose, but she was trying, and something about that determination reminded Cass of herself at that age. "My mama used to sew," Ruby said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Papa says she could make anything beautiful." Cass's hands stilled. She must have been talented. She was. Ruby's voice grew softer. "She got sick 3 winters ago. The doctor couldn't help her. I'm sorry, sweetheart." Ruby nodded, still focused on her stitching. "Papa says she's watching over us from heaven, that she'd be proud of who I'm becoming." Cass's throat tightened. She looked across the camp to where Cole was stacking wood, his movements methodical, purposeful, a man carrying grief and responsibility in equal measure. "I'm sure she would be," Cass said gently. "You're a brave girl, Ruby." That evening, after a simple supper of beans and the rabbits Cole had snared, they sat around the fire as the rain pattered softly on the roof. Ruby was nestled between them, wrapped in Cass's blanket, fighting sleep but losing. "Tell us a story," Ruby murmured, her eyes already half closed. Cass looked at Cole, who shrugged with a slight smile. "Don't look at me. I'm terrible at stories." "That's true," Ruby mumbled. "Papa only knows boring ones about cattle and contracts." Cole laughed, a genuine, warm sound that surprised Cass. Boring but true. Cass found herself smiling. "All right then, let me think." She stared into the fire, memories surfacing. There was once a wild Mustang that roamed these canyons, silver as moonlight, faster than the wind. She wove a tale of the silver Mustang and a young girl who refused to break its spirit, who instead earned its trust through patience and kindness. Ruby's breathing grew slower, deeper, but Cass kept talking, her voice soft, until the little girl was fully asleep. Cole carefully lifted Ruby and carried her inside to the bedroll they'd made for her. When he returned, he sat across from Cass, the fire crackling between them. "That was a good story," he said. "My father used to tell it to me," Cass replied, surprised she'd shared that. She didn't talk about her father, didn't talk about before. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was." Cass poked at the fire. "He taught me everything. How to ride, how to shoot, how to survive out here. Then he got trampled during a roundup when I was 16. Cole's expression softened with understanding. "And you've been on your own since?" "More or less." Cass shrugged, but the gesture was too casual, too practiced. You learn to make do. You do more than make do, Cole said quietly. You've built a life here, on your own terms. Cass looked at him then, really looked at him. In the firelight, his face was open, honest. No pity in his eyes, just respect. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. What about you? She asked. Copper Ridge has hotels. Why were you really out here, Cole, in the middle of nowhere with a sick child? Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. Running, he finally said, from expectations. From people who want things from me that I'm not sure I can give. He looked up at her. Sometimes you need to disappear for a while. Remember who you are when no one's watching. Cass nodded slowly. She understood that better than he knew. Well, she said softly, you picked a hell of a place to disappear. Cole smiled. Maybe. Or maybe it was exactly where I needed to be. The fire popped and crackled. Neither of them spoke, but something had shifted between them, something fragile and new, like the first shoots of green after a long winter. Something that felt dangerously close to trust. The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, the storm finally spent. Cass woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the shack's walls, painting golden stripes across the floor. For a moment she lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of the camp, the crackle of a fire being built, the soft murmur of voices outside. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and felt something strange settle in her chest. The camp felt full now, alive, like it had been waiting for people to fill it. She pushed the thought away as she stepped outside. Cole was already up, packing his saddlebags with quiet efficiency. Ruby sat nearby, braiding a small length of rope Cass had given her, her face scrunched in concentration. The horses were saddled, ready to go. Cass's stomach dropped. Roads should be clear now, Cole said, without looking up. We should make Copper Ridge by nightfall if we leave soon. Right, Cass said, her voice coming out rougher than intended. Good. That's it, good. Ruby looked up, her expression falling. Do we have to go? Ruby, Cole's voice was gentle but firm. We've imposed on Miss Brennan long enough. But I like it here, Ruby protested, her bottom lip trembling. And Cass said she'd teach me how to braid a proper lasso. Cass crouched down, meeting Ruby's eyes. And I will. Next time I see you, I promise. When will that be? Ruby asked, hopeful. Cass glanced at Cole, who was watching them with an unreadable expression. I don't know, sweetheart, but promises are important. I don't make ones I can't keep. Ruby nodded slowly, then launched herself forward, wrapping her small arms around Cass's neck. The embrace was sudden, fierce, and completely unexpected. Cass froze for just a moment before her arms came up, holding the little girl close. Thank you for saving us, Ruby whispered. Cass's throat tightened painfully. You take care of yourself, little one. When Ruby finally pulled back, Cole had finished packing. He stood there, hat in hand, looking at Cass with something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. I need to ride into town, Cass said suddenly, the lie coming easily. Get supplies. Mrs. Patterson at the general store has been holding some things for me. It wasn't true. She just couldn't watch them leave, couldn't stand there and wave goodbye like it didn't matter. Cole studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he knew exactly what she was doing. But he just nodded. Be safe out there. Always am. Cass saddled Rusty quickly, her movements jerky, uncoordinated. She swung up into the saddle without looking back, kicked her heels, and rode off toward Copper Ridge at a pace faster than necessary. She didn't let herself think about what she was running from. The ride to town took 2 hours. Cass wandered through the general store without purpose, buying nothing, then sat in the empty saloon, nursing a whiskey she didn't want. By the time she rode back, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls orange and red. The camp was empty. Cass dismounted slowly, her eyes scanning the space, that suddenly felt too large, too quiet. The fire had been carefully banked, still glowing with embers. The woodpile Cole had built was stacked neatly under a tarp she didn't own. The roof he'd patched looked solid, professional, but they were gone. She walked to the fire, and that's when she saw it. A small bundle wrapped in cloth, placed carefully on the flat rock she used as a table. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside was a leather pouch, heavy with coins. More money than she'd seen in years. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper, the handwriting neat and precise. For everything you gave us, shelter, kindness, and a reminder that good people still exist in this hard world. The money is not charity. It's payment for a debt I can never truly repay. You saved more than our lives. You reminded me what matters. If you ever need anything at all, come to Silver Creek Trading Company in Copper Ridge. Ask for me, Cole Colton. Cass stared at the name, her mind racing. Silver Creek Trading Company. She'd heard of it. Everyone had. It was the largest cattle and mining operation in 3 territories. The man who owned it was said to be wealthier than some state governors. Her hands shook as she looked at the money, then back at the note. Cole Colton. He hadn't been running from expectations. He'd been running from an empire. And she'd let him sleep by her fire, never knowing she was sheltering one of the richest men in the West. Cass sank down onto the crate. The note clutched in her fist, and for the first time since her father died, she let herself cry, not from grief, but from the aching emptiness of something beautiful that had slipped through her fingers before she'd even realized she was holding it. The fire crackled softly. The camp had never felt so alone. 3 weeks passed like a slow bleed. Cass tried to fall back into her old rhythm, working odd jobs, scraping by, surviving day to day. But something had fundamentally changed. The camp felt hollow now, echoing with ghost laughter and memories of a little girl's questions, of a man who'd looked at her like she mattered. She'd hidden Cole's money in a tin buried beneath the floorboards, untouched. Taking it felt wrong, like accepting payment for something that shouldn't have a price. But she'd kept the note. Reading it so many times, the paper had grown soft at the creases. Then everything fell apart. It started with Rusty. The mare had been favoring her left foreleg for days, and when Doc Wheeler, who doctored animals as often as people, finally looked at her, his expression told Cass everything she needed to know. "Tendon's torn bad," he said, running his weathered hands down the horse's leg. "She needs rest, months of it. No riding, no work." Cass's stomach dropped. "How long?" 4 months minimum, maybe 6. He straightened, his eyes sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Cass. I know she's your livelihood." Without Rusty, Cass couldn't take the ranch work that kept her fed through winter, couldn't haul supplies, couldn't do half the jobs that required traveling beyond walking distance. She was grounded, trapped. 2 days later, she showed up at the Copper Ridge livery for her regular mucking job, only to find a new hand already working the stalls, a drifter willing to work for half her wage. "Nothing personal," the owner said, not meeting her eyes. "Business is slow. Can't afford to keep you both." Cass walked out without a word, her last steady income gone. By the end of the month, her food stores were nearly depleted. The winter she'd been preparing for loomed like a death sentence. She sat by the fire one freezing night, counting what little money she had left, $3.40. Maybe enough for a week's worth of beans and flour if she stretched it. She looked at the tin hidden under the floorboards, feeling its weight even from across the room. Pride was a funny thing. It kept you warm when you had nothing else, but it couldn't fill an empty stomach. She still couldn't bring herself to dig it up. The next morning, she walked the 4 miles into Copper Ridge, hoping to find day work, anything. The town was busy, cattlemen and miners moving through the streets with purpose. She stopped at the post office, the saloon, the hotel, anywhere that might need an extra hand. Nothing. She was sitting on a bench outside the general store trying to figure out her next move when Mrs. Patterson emerged, a letter in her weathered hand. "Cass Brennan?" the older woman called. Cass looked up, surprised. "Yes, ma'am?" "This came for you. Special courier brought it this morning." Mrs. Patterson handed over a cream-colored envelope, thick and expensive-looking. "Must be important." Cass took it slowly, her heart beginning to pound. Her name was written across the front in elegant script. She turned it over. The wax seal bore an embossed SC, Silver Creek. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Miss Cassidy Brennan, Silver Creek Trading Company is seeking to expand our operations and requires individuals of exceptional character to oversee our community initiatives. Your name has been personally recommended for a position as territory representative. This role involves traveling to remote communities, assessing needs, and distributing resources to those who have been overlooked by traditional business interests. The position offers competitive salary, room and board, and the opportunity to make a real difference. Should you be interested, please present yourself at our main office in Copper Ridge at your earliest convenience. Ask for Martha Hayes, who will facilitate your interview. Time-sensitive opportunity. Respectfully, James Colton, Chief Executive Officer, Silver Creek Trading Company." Cass read it twice, then 3 times, her mind reeling. A job, a real job, with steady pay and a roof over her head, from Cole. She looked up at the Silver Creek building across the street, 3 stories of brick and glass dominating the town square. The largest building in Copper Ridge. Through the windows, she could see people moving with purpose, conducting the business of an empire. Her pride screamed at her to tear up the letter, to refuse what felt like charity dressed up as opportunity. But her empty stomach and her lame horse and her dwindling hope whispered something different. Maybe this wasn't charity. Maybe it was a door opening, a chance she'd be a fool to refuse. Cass stood slowly, clutching the letter, and stared at the building. Inside those walls was the man who'd sat by her fire, who'd looked at her with respect instead of pity, who'd seen something in her worth remembering. She thought of Ruby's smile, of Cole's quiet gratitude, of the 3 days when her camp had felt like home. Taking a deep breath, Cass crossed the street. It was time to find out what came next. The Silver Creek Trading Company headquarters was even more intimidating on the inside. Polished wood floors, brass fixtures, and the quiet hum of serious money being made. Cass felt every eye turn toward her as she entered. A dusty cowgirl in worn boots and a patched coat, stepping into a world of tailored suits and polished manners. She approached the front desk, where a young man with slicked hair looked up with barely concealed disdain. "I'm here to see Martha Hayes," Cass said, keeping her voice steady. "I have an appointment." The man's eyebrow arched. "Name?" "Cassidy Brennan." He flipped through a ledger, his expression shifting to surprise. One moment, he disappeared through a door, returning quickly. "Second floor, first office on the right." Martha Hayes turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Cass immediately respected. She stood as Cass entered, extending her hand. "Miss Brennan, we've been expecting you." Her handshake was firm, genuine. "Mr. Colton spoke very highly of you." "Did he?" Cass settled into the offered chair, trying not to show how nervous she felt. "He did. Said you were resourceful, honest, and had more integrity in your little finger than most of his board members combined." Martha smiled. "That's high praise from a man who doesn't give it easily." Cass's chest tightened at the words. Is Mr. Colton here?" "He's in meetings all day. But he'll want to see you once we get you situated." Martha pulled out a folder. "Now let's talk about the position. You'd be traveling to remote settlements, identifying families who are in need, distributing supplies, and reporting back on community concerns. It's not easy work. Long days, rough conditions, difficult decisions about limited resources." "Sounds like every day of my life," Cass said. Martha laughed. "Yes, I suppose it would. That's exactly why you're perfect for it." She slid a paper across the desk. "This is the salary offer. Room and board included when you're in town." Cass looked at the number and felt her breath catch. It was more than she'd made in the last 3 years combined. This is too much." "It's what the position pays," Martha said firmly. "Mr. Colton insists on fair wages, says people do better work when they're not worried about starving." Over the next hour, Martha walked her through the details, the territories she'd cover, the resources at her disposal, the families already identified as needing help. It was real work, important work, not some manufactured position designed to ease a guilty conscience. Cass signed the papers, her hand shaking slightly. "Welcome to Silver Creek," Martha said warmly. "You start Monday. We'll set you up with an office, supplies, and a good horse, one of Mr. Colton's personal stock." Cass floated through the rest of the afternoon in a daze. She had a job, a real job, a purpose beyond simple survival. But the dream shattered exactly 1 week later. Cass was working late in her small office, reviewing supply requests, when Martha burst through the door, her face pale. "Cass, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Martha closed the door, lowering her voice. "Someone's been embezzling from the community fund. Significant amounts. And the ledgers." She hesitated. "The ledgers show your signature authorizing the transfers." Cass's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. I haven't authorized anything beyond the standard distributions." "I know that, but Vernon Blackwell is presenting evidence to the board tomorrow morning. He's calling for your immediate termination and criminal charges." Vernon Blackwell, Cole's senior manager, a man who'd made his disdain for Cass clear from day one. He'd questioned her qualifications, her background, her right to be there. And now he was trying to destroy her. "This is a setup," Cass said, standing. "He's been against me since I arrived." "I believe you," Martha said. "But the board won't care about belief. They'll care about evidence, and right now all the evidence points to you." Cass's mind raced. "Where's Cole?" "In Santa Fe. Won't be back until tomorrow afternoon, after the board meeting. Perfect timing." Blackwell had waited until Cole was gone to make his move. Cass sank back into her chair, the familiar weight of injustice settling on her shoulders. She'd clawed her way up from nothing, had finally found a place where she belonged, where she could make a difference. And now it was being ripped away by a man who saw her as nothing more than an outsider who didn't deserve to be here. "What do I do?" Cass asked quietly. Martha's expression hardened. "We fight. We have until morning to prove your innocence." She rolled up her sleeves. "So let's get to work." Cass looked at this woman who barely knew her, who was willing to risk her own position to help. She thought of Cole, of Ruby, of the chance they'd given her. She wasn't going down without a fight. "All right," Cass said, standing. "Show me everything. Every ledger, every transfer, every signature. If Blackwell made a mistake, we're going to find it." The night was going to be long, but Cass had survived worse. Cass and Martha spread ledgers across every surface in the office, tracing transactions, comparing signatures, following the money trail that Vernon Blackwell had carefully constructed to point directly at Cass. It was meticulous work, designed by someone who knew the system inside and out. But he'd made mistakes, small ones, the kind only someone looking closely would notice. "Here," Cass said, around 3 a.m, her eyes burning from strain. She pointed to a transfer dated 2 weeks before she'd even been hired. "This one has my signature, but I wasn't even working here yet." Martha leaned in, studying the entry. He got sloppy. Probably figured no one would check the dates that carefully. They found 3 more. Transfers made on days Cass had been out in the field, miles from town, with witnesses who could verify her location. And then the crucial piece, a pattern. The embezzled funds had been deposited into an account registered to a shell company. With some digging through public records, they traced it back to a property owned by Blackwell's brother-in-law. By dawn, they had everything they needed: The board meeting was set for 9 o'clock. Cass walked into the conference room with her head high and her evidence under her arm, Martha beside her. The board members, 7 wealthy ranchers and businessmen, sat around the long table, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Vernon Blackwell sat at the far end, confident, smug. He barely glanced at Cass as she entered. "Gentlemen," Blackwell began, standing, "thank you for convening on short notice. I've discovered serious financial irregularities in our community fund. Miss Brennan has been systematically embezzling." "That's a lie," Cass interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "Miss Brennan, you'll have your chance to speak. Right now." "Right now, you're going to sit down and listen," Cass said, stepping forward. She dropped the stack of ledgers on the table with a heavy thud. "Because I'm about to prove that you're the thief, and you tried to frame me for it." Murmurs rippled through the board members. Blackwell's confident expression flickered. "This is preposterous." "Is it?" Cass opened the first ledger, pointing to the highlighted entries. "These transfers show my signature authorizing funds, except this one is dated September 12th. I wasn't hired until September 28th. She looked up at the board. Kind of hard to embezzle from a job I didn't have yet. One of the board members leaned forward, studying the entry. "She's right. The date doesn't match." "A clerical error," Blackwell started. "3 clerical errors," Martha interjected, stepping forward with more documents, "all conveniently placing Miss Brennan at the scene of transfers she couldn't possibly have made. She was in Red Canyon on this date, witnessed by Doc Wheeler and Sheriff Clayton. She was in Bent Creek on this date, with signed receipts from the supply distribution." Cass pulled out the final piece of evidence. "And all the money went here, to Blackwell Properties, LLC, registered to one Michael Blackwell, your brother-in-law Vernon." The room went silent. Blackwell's face had gone from smug to pale. "You can't possibly." "We can," Cass said coldly, "and we did. You've been skimming from the community fund for months, probably since it was established. You got nervous when Mr. Colton hired someone to actually oversee the distributions, someone who might notice the discrepancies. So you tried to get rid of me the easiest way you knew how, by making me the scapegoat." One of the board members stood, his expression thunderous. "Vernon, is this true?" Blackwell opened his mouth, closed it, then suddenly lunged for the door. He didn't make it 2 steps before it swung open. Cole Colton stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. His eyes swept over the scene, the scattered ledgers, Cass standing tall with evidence in hand, Blackwell frozen mid-escape. "Going somewhere, Vernon?" Cole's voice was quiet, deadly calm. "Mr. Colton, I can explain—" "I doubt that." Cole stepped aside, and 2 men in badges entered behind him, federal marshals. "These gentlemen have some questions for you about wire fraud and embezzlement." As the marshals led Blackwell away, his protests echoing down the hallway, Cole turned to the board. "Meeting adjourned. Miss Brennan's innocence is established. Anyone have a problem with that?" Silence. Then heads shaking, murmurs of agreement. The board members filed out, leaving Cass and Cole alone in the conference room. Martha had slipped out quietly, closing the door behind her. Cole looked at Cass, really looked at her, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "You didn't need me to save you." "No," Cass agreed, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "But I'm glad you showed up anyway. I got Martha's telegram at midnight. Rode straight through." He stepped closer. "I knew you didn't do it. I knew what kind of person you are." "How?" Cass asked softly. "You barely know me." "I know you shared your fire when you had every reason not to. I know you saved my daughter's life. I know you fixed your own roof and survived alone in those canyons through sheer grit." His voice softened. "I know enough." Cass felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept locked away for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "The job's still yours," Cole continued, "if you want it. But I understand if you'd rather. I want it, Cass said quickly. I want to help those families. I want to make a difference. Cole smiled, that rare, genuine smile she remembered from the firelight. Good, because there's a lot of work to do. 2 years later, the Silver Creek Community Initiative had expanded across 5 territories. Cass had helped over 300 families, established schools in remote settlements, and built a reputation as someone who actually gave a damn about people the world had forgotten. She stood now at the opening ceremony of the newest school, a solid building with glass windows and rows of desks, built in a settlement that had never had anything like it. Ruby, now 9 years old and bursting with energy, cut the ribbon while the community cheered. Cole stood beside Cass, and when Ruby ran to them, she hugged them both. "Did I do good?" Ruby asked, beaming. "You did perfect," Cass said, ruffling her hair. Ruby looked between them, then grinned mischievously. "Are you two ever going to admit you like each other? Or do I have to keep pretending not to notice?" Cass felt her face heat. Cole coughed, clearing his throat awkwardly. But when their eyes met over Ruby's head, they both smiled. Some things were worth the wait, and some fires once lit never really went out. They just kept burning, steady and warm, lighting the way home.